It's not actually scripted, but who wants to hear Banjo Harris Plane, sommelier of Attica, perform the natural wine rap? Banjo?
Banjo?
Do you consent? All right, can we give him a beat,
Can
anyone?
we give him a beat?
Oh, for goodness sake, it's just a fucking bunch of grapes. Picked them, pressed them, crushed them. But I made a few mistakes. Forgot to add the sulfur. I didn't inoculate. But still, they started fermenting. Now I'm watching the temperature escalate.
Word.
It grew in flora, but was raised in amphora. Some people frown because the colour's kind of brown. Hue, hazy, volatile, maybe. Flavours crazy, acid for days, baby. This is natural wine for the gentlemen and the ladies, for those who ride bicycles and those who drive Mercedes, for adults, teenagers, and even for the babies.
Yeah.
For those who believe that this land is sacred and drinking these drinks can bring us closer to nature.
Banjo Harris Plane.
I'm sorry to bring the tone down after Michael's beautiful speech. But today I wanted to talk about booze, hooch, sauce, piss. These are all convivial but casual expressions in the Australian vernacular for fermented beverages. Fermented beverages have existed since probably before mankind. Within Australia, some of the local indigenous people used to ferment things such as honey, the sap from various gum trees, native fruits like quandongs, all to produce beverages that would induce a form of euphoria. In terms of drinking culture, however, that didn't really set in until the arrival of the white man in Australia. I'm going to get to that a bit later, the drinking culture. I wanted to talk a little bit first about what these fermented beverages are to me. I exist in my professional life because of these fermented beverages. They're not just stimulants for the palate, but also for the mind, I feel. They're more than that. They're, for me, elements of culture that can not only connect us to our past, but can also be tools for communication between cultures. Where there is no common language, these fermented beverages can exist in the same way that art helps us to communicate, that music helps us to communicate, that food helps us to communicate between cultures. Because of this, I feel that we should respect piss in all its varied forms. But unfortunately, I'm not sure that we here in Australia often do that. And that has some historical reasons. I'm a sommelier, and I'm lucky enough to deal with the upper echelons of fine wine and other fermented beverages on a daily basis. But my introduction to fermented beverages, at least in my mind, what I can remember, occurred, like many people in this room, I'm sure, when I was about 15 years old. And I went to a party, and I drank 7 or 8 cans of Victoria Bitter in about an hour. And then I threw up everywhere, and then I passed out. And you know what? That's kind of fun when you're 15, but that's not really cool. Looking back on it, I have a sneaking suspicion that my introduction to fermented beverages, after some research, is a little bit indicative of the drinking culture that exists in Australia and how it began in Australia. We're lucky enough to have a thriving and vibrant wine and beverage industry right now in 2014. But when white man settled in Australia, they brought with them this drink to excess drinking culture. In England at the time, there were epidemics of gin abuse sweeping through suburbs of London and destroying communities and families. Really cheap, poor quality alcohol was being consumed in large quantities and making people literally go crazy. When people settled within Australia, the lack of proper ingredients to make a drink such as gin led them to look for ingredients that grew in abundance in Australia. Something that was found quite easily was sugarcane, and this translated into the production of, again, fairly low quality but large amounts of rum. Some beer was brewed, very basic wines were made, sort of around the early 1800s, but it was really rum that dominated, and indeed people at the time were paid in rum from time to time. Before money was traded, alcohol, as part of other goods, were often given in exchange for labour and for services. This production of alcohol carried on, and by sort of the early 1800s, maybe the 1850s, vineyards were planted across various parts of Australia, and that was really the beginning of the wine industry. By the late 1800s, Australian wines were gaining recognition overseas. Pubs began to spring up in many metropolitan areas, and as Australia progressed and became slowly a more and more secular society, pubs began to replace churches as meeting places for these communities. The Australian pub of the 1920s, 30s and 40s was not so different to the pubs of today in some respects. There was scant regard for decor and ambience. The crowds were male-dominated. The music was loud and often shit. The food selection, if it existed, was poor. People went to these venues under the guise of meeting and of community, but they really went there to drink. And up until the 1960s, there occurred in Australian pubs what is these days referred to as the 6 o'clock swill. Pubs would close at 6 p.m. by government mandate, so blokes who had been at the pub for 2 or 3 hours already were suddenly told, "Hurry up guys, the bar's closing in 15 minutes, get in while you can." People would charge the bar, order 3 or 4 drinks in quick succession, and then return home to their families, to their wives, to their children. The modern day equivalent of this is something that's being championed by governments around Australia at the moment. It's called the lockout system, whereby blokes who have been drinking for 2 or 3 hours are suddenly told that they can't enter the venue that they'd like to, and then they return home to their wives, their families and their children, inebriated, heavily so often. The wisdom of this lockout system is questioned by many, and the benefits, I feel, are yet to be seen amongst the community. There has been something of a change lately, I feel, within Australia. A change within our regard for fermented beverages, and a change perhaps in a positive direction in the drinking culture of Australia. This is driven in part, I feel, by the upward rise of our restaurant scene, and also by an increase in the number of often members of the younger generation who are focusing more on what I'd like to call an artisanal approach to beverage production as opposed to an industrial one. Speaking about wine specifically, the history of Australian beverages was built on this industrial scale production. The companies that were winning awards and gaining renown overseas were larger companies who owned vast tracts of land, farmed them industrially, and produced wines which other parts of the world hadn't necessarily seen before. They were wines filled with fruit and sunshine, but they weren't necessarily wines that spoke of the place where they came from. There's been a shift in the last 20 years towards wines that speak of a particular place, and these wines are being championed in our amazing restaurant industry. I'd like to think that this approach is more in line with countries in some parts of Europe, like France and Spain and Italy, countries where a history of wine production has existed for hundreds of years. And I don't mean this to be a cultural cringe, it's just a historical precedent. These places with a big history of wine production have focused their community on food, the wine that goes with it, and congregation at the table. It's no surprise or coincidence that visiting small pockets of France or Spain or Italy, that the wines that they drink there match perfectly with the foods that they create or they harvest. Quite often the wines are used in the production of those foods. Wine, along with food, is brought together at the table to bring the family together. I was lucky enough to grow up in a family such as this. My parents owned restaurants when I was younger, but whenever they weren't working, my mother, who was an amazing cook, would always have dinner for us on the table. There would be beautiful wines for me and my brother to sample, and these would be introduced to us in a positive way, and a discussion of food and wine would take place at the table. I wanted this talk, this discussion, to be an exploration of the ideas of the place of fermented beverages within Australian society and within culture. But I also wanted it to be a call to all of you in this room to consider the place that fermented beverages have in your life. To not necessarily ignore the euphoric effects that you can gain from them sometimes, but don't be scared of those. Embrace them and use them and harness them to engender creativity. This time-honoured process of fermentation, in all its permutations, creates flavours that are deep, profound, and delicious. Embrace them and enjoy them.